The crystal chandelier exploded into 1,000 glittering fragments as Carter's fist connected with the priceless fixture, raining glass across the marble floor like deadly snow. Cooper stood on the imported silk tablecloth, hurling gold-plated forks at terrified guests who pressed themselves against walls decorated with fresh orchids. The ballroom had been transformed into a war zone in under 15 minutes. 5-year-old destroyers leaving chaos that would make headlines if anyone dared report what happened inside Roman Marino's private celebrations. Roman stood near the ruined birthday cake, his tailored suit immaculate despite the surrounding destruction, jaw muscles working beneath olive skin as he calculated damage that went far beyond shattered crystal. 300 guests watched their host's sons with the kind of frozen terror usually reserved for natural disasters. Nobody moving to intervene because everyone understood the cost of touching the untouchable. These weren't ordinary children throwing tantrums. They were heirs to an empire built on fear and absolute control. Carter grabbed a champagne bottle and swung it like a club at a security guard, who'd made the mistake of stepping too close, connecting with the man's knee hard enough to draw a grunt of pain. The guard stumbled backward, hands raised in surrender, unwilling to defend himself against a kindergartner because losing a kneecap was better than losing everything. Cooper joined his brother, both boys screaming wordless rage that echoed off vaulted ceilings painted with Renaissance reproductions. Roman's lieutenant approached cautiously, keeping distance that suggested he was addressing a bomb rather than his boss, voice pitched low enough that nearby guests couldn't hear. "Sir, we've tried everything. Removed all the other children, cleared the entertainment, even brought in specialists from Boston." The man's carefully neutral expression couldn't hide underlying fear that came from knowing Roman Marino didn't accept failure, especially not public failure. The lieutenant's tablet displayed a list of attempted interventions that read like catalog of desperation. Behavioral therapists who'd quit after single sessions, child psychologists who'd recommended psychiatric evaluation, even a renowned expert in childhood trauma who'd left the mansion visibly shaken. Each specialist had offered different diagnoses ranging from attachment disorders to early-onset conduct problems, but none had provided solutions that worked beyond temporary containment. Roman had paid 6-figure fees for advice that amounted to give them time or consider residential treatment, suggestions that felt like admissions of defeat dressed up as professional recommendations. The money had been meaningless, the failures accumulating into evidence that some problems couldn't be solved by throwing resources at them, that his sons existed in category of broken that defied conventional repair. The guest list for tonight's party had been carefully curated to include only the most powerful families, people whose children attended exclusive schools, and whose opinions shaped social hierarchies throughout the city. Roman had intended this celebration to be showcase of his legacy, proof that the Marino line would continue with strength and sophistication that matched his own reputation. Instead, these influential witnesses were seeing chaos that undermined every message he'd wanted to send, watching his heirs behave like feral animals rather than groomed successors. The damage to his carefully constructed image was catastrophic in ways that went beyond simple embarrassment, calling into question his competence in every arena if he couldn't manage his own household. Carter found a serving tray that had somehow survived the initial destruction and began using it as a weapon, swinging the heavy silver at anything within reach with surprising accuracy for someone so young. A ice sculpture of a swan, commissioned from artist who'd flown in from Switzerland specifically for this event, shattered under the impact into thousands of glittering fragments. Cooper applauded his brother's destruction with manic glee before grabbing his own makeshift weapon, a candlestick holder that was probably worth more than most people's cars. The synchronized violence between the twins suggested communication that went beyond normal sibling connection, like they were operating from shared consciousness that made them twice as destructive as 2 individual children would be. The guests had formed a rough semicircle around the perimeter of the ballroom, instinctively creating barrier between themselves and the chaos, while simultaneously ensuring they had clear view of the spectacle. Several people had their phones out now despite earlier warnings about photography, capturing footage that would inevitably leak regardless of threats Roman might issue later. A woman in the back was live streaming to her social media, whispering commentary about the Marino meltdown to her followers, and Roman's security team was too focused on the immediate crisis to notice the documentation happening in real time. This night would follow him forever, digital permanence ensuring that no amount of damage control could erase what was being witnessed and recorded by 300 people with no loyalty strong enough to guarantee their silence. The boys found a table still holding dishes and began methodically throwing porcelain plates like frisbees, each crash punctuating the uncomfortable silence. Guests who'd come expecting lavish celebration now stood trapped between doors they couldn't leave without permission, and children they couldn't approach without invitation. Roman had spent $250,000 on this party, hired performers from 3 continents, all to celebrate sons who seemed determined to prove money couldn't buy peace. A server made the critical mistake of trying to salvage a tray of desserts from the twins' reach, moving quickly but not quickly enough to escape Cooper's teeth sinking into his forearm. The man yelped and jerked away, blood seeping through his white sleeve while the boy laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever witnessed. Carter joined the laughter, high-pitched and manic, and together they sounded like something from a nightmare rather than a birthday celebration. Roman's hands clenched into fists at his sides because this was beyond discipline problems or spoiled behavior. This was something broken, something that made his chest tight. Men in his position weren't supposed to feel helpless, weren't supposed to stand paralyzed while their legacy destroyed itself in front of witnesses. The twins had been progressively worse for months, immune to discipline or reason, or the endless parade of specialists who left shaking their heads. Cooper picked up a shard of broken crystal and held it like a dagger, his small fingers wrapped around the jagged edge with disturbing confidence. Carter mirrored his brother's posture, grabbing his own weapon from the glittering debris, both boys moving in synchronized patterns that made them seem like one creature. Guests pressed further back against the walls. Someone whimpered near the emergency exit, and Roman felt control slipping through his fingers like water. The head of security, a former military specialist who'd faced armed insurgents without flinching, stood frozen 15 feet from the twins with sweat beading on his forehead. His hand hovered near his radio, but didn't reach for it, because what backup could possibly help when the threat was untouchable by definition. The other guards formed a loose perimeter that kept guests away from the danger zone, but offered no solutions to the central problem. Carter threw his crystal shard at a priceless painting imported from France, the jagged edge tearing through canvas that had survived 2 centuries, only to be destroyed by a 5-year-old. Cooper applauded his brother's accuracy, then grabbed a handful of birthday cake and hurled it at a woman wearing diamonds worth more than most houses. The frosting splattered across her face and she stood there frozen, too terrified to even wipe it away, knowing any reaction might draw worse attention. Roman's jaw ached from clenching his teeth, watching his sons reduce years of careful reputation building to rubble with every destructive act. These boys were supposed to be his legacy, proof that his empire would continue beyond his lifetime, yet they seemed determined to burn everything down. Nobody in this room would forget tonight, would ever look at him the same way, because a man who couldn't control his own children couldn't possibly control anything else. The twins found the gift table and began ripping through wrapped presents like wild animals, tearing paper and throwing contents across the room without even looking at what they'd received. A toy train set shattered against marble. A leather-bound book collection landed in the remains of the cake. Designer clothes meant for growing boys became projectiles. Each destroyed gift represented someone's attempt to curry favor with Roman, and watching it all reduced to garbage felt like watching his influence evaporate in real time. Cooper grabbed a violin that had been part of the planned entertainment, a Stradivarius borrowed from a private collection, and raised it over his head, preparing to smash it. Roman's voice finally emerged, sharp and commanding enough to cut through the chaos, freezing everyone in place, including his own security team. But the boy just looked at him with eyes that held no recognition of authority, no fear of consequences, just blank defiance that made Roman's blood run cold. The violin crashed against the floor, wood splintering into pieces that could never be repaired, and Cooper smiled at his father like he'd just won a contest. Carter ran to join him, both boys now standing in the center of destruction they'd created, chests heaving with exertion but showing no signs of exhaustion. Roman realized with sinking certainty that they could keep this up for hours, that there was no end in sight, that his entire celebration had become a public execution of his credibility. A woman near the back began crying silently, mascara running down her cheeks, but she didn't dare leave without permission from the host. Other guests had similar expressions of trapped misery, aristocratic faces trying to maintain composure while watching a nightmare unfold. The twins had managed to make 300 powerful people feel powerless, had reduced the city's elite to frightened spectators, and Roman understood that this moment would define him forever, unless something changed. Carter found a champagne flute that had somehow survived the initial destruction, and threw it with surprising force at the remains of the chandelier. The glass connected with metal, producing a sharp ringing sound that seemed to please him immensely, because he immediately searched for more ammunition. Cooper joined the hunt, both boys now focused on creating the loudest possible crashes, competing with each other for who could cause the most dramatic destruction. Roman's breathing had become shallow, his usual iron control fracturing under the weight of public humiliation that seemed designed specifically to break him. These were his sons, his blood, yet they felt like strangers who'd infiltrated his life specifically to dismantle everything he'd built. The realization that he didn't know how to reach them, didn't understand what drove this relentless destruction, felt like failure on a level he'd never experienced in his carefully controlled existence. Roman raised his hand for silence, the gesture cutting through murmured conversations like a blade through silk, every eye turning toward him with mixture of curiosity and dread. His voice emerged steady despite the chaos surrounding him, projecting authority that had been built over decades of commanding dangerous men in dangerous situations. $1 million to anyone who can make them stop, he announced, the words falling into stunned silence as guests processed an offer that confirmed their host's desperation. The amount was staggering enough to change lives, yet nobody moved toward the twins who continued their destruction seemingly unaware of the bounty just placed on their cooperation. Roman's security team exchanged glances, but none stepped forward, their previous failed attempts still fresh in memory, along with the teeth marks and bruises. A child psychologist who'd been invited as a guest shifted uncomfortably, but remained frozen against the wall. Professional expertise, apparently insufficient motivation to risk approaching the boys. Carter overheard his father's declaration and laughed, a sound that held disturbing maturity for someone who'd just blown out 5 candles on a cake. "Nobody can stop us," he shouted with confidence that seemed impossible for his age, like he understood exactly what power meant in this room. Cooper echoed his brother's sentiment by grabbing another plate and hurling it at the nearest window, the glass spiderwebbing but not shattering completely. Roman's lieutenant approached him again, voice dropping to barely audible whisper that carried urgency bordering on panic despite trained composure. "Sir, perhaps we should clear the room, handle this privately without so many witnesses to the—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence because there were no polite words for watching a man's legacy self-destruct in real time. But Roman shook his head sharply because retreat would be admission of defeat, would confirm to everyone present that he'd lost control completely. A businessman near the bar, someone who'd made his fortune in construction and feared nothing, took 3 steps toward the twins before Carter's eyes locked onto him. The boy's expression transformed into something feral, mouth opening to reveal small teeth in what looked disturbingly like threat display, and the man froze mid-step. Whatever he saw in that 5-year-old's face convinced him the $1 million wasn't worth the cost, and he retreated back to the safety of the crowd. Cooper found the elaborate centerpieces that had been crafted by an award-winning florist, arrangements of rare orchids and roses that had taken days to perfect. He grabbed one and threw it at a cluster of guests, soil and petals exploding across expensive suits and dresses, roots dangling like tentacles. Carter immediately copied his brother, both boys now systematically destroying every centerpiece within reach, while guests scrambled to avoid the botanical assault. Roman's hands trembled slightly at his sides, the only external sign of internal earthquake that was reshaping his understanding of control and power. He'd built an empire on the principle that everything had a price, that any problem could be solved with sufficient resources or force. Yet here stood 2 small boys proving that principle catastrophically wrong, demonstrating that some chaos couldn't be purchased into submission. The $1 million offer had been impulsive, thrown out in moment of desperation without consideration for how it would be interpreted by the crowd. Some guests were exchanging glances that suggested they thought Roman had lost his mind along with his control, while others looked calculating like they were genuinely considering whether the money was worth the risk. A few people near the back had started quiet conversations about whether this was appropriate environment for children at all, voices carrying just loud enough that Roman could hear their judgment. The whispers about his parenting would spread through social circles faster than any official statement could counter them. Narrative forming in real time that Roman Marino couldn't handle his own sons, that the great man's weakness was housed in 2 small bodies he'd created, but couldn't control. Carter had discovered the elaborate dessert table that had been prepared by pastry chef who'd trained in Paris, creations that were edible art rather than simple sweets. He grabbed a chocolate sculpture of a horse, meticulously crafted with details that had taken hours to perfect, and bit off its head with exaggerated aggression before throwing the remains at the nearest group of guests. Chocolate splattered across designer clothes, the recipients too shocked to react immediately, frozen in tableau of disbelief that children could be this deliberately destructive. Cooper joined the dessert assault, both boys now systematically destroying each piece before launching it at different targets, turning gourmet confections into ammunition in war against everyone present. Roman's mother had always told him that children were reflections of their parents' character, that well-raised boys demonstrated the quality of their lineage through behavior and discipline. The memory of her lectures felt like accusation from beyond the grave, confirmation that Roman had failed at fundamental level that went beyond business or reputation into realm of basic human competence. His mother would have handled this situation with iron control, would have dominated these boys into submission through sheer force of will and strategic punishment. But Roman had tried her methods, and they'd only made things worse, creating a cycle of escalating violence that suggested his mother's wisdom had been cruelty disguised as strength, legacy of damage that was now manifesting in his sons. The other children who'd been present earlier had been removed when the twins' behavior had escalated beyond typical birthday party chaos, parents collecting their offspring with expressions that mixed concern for their own kids' safety with judgment about the Marino household. Roman had overheard fragments of conversations as families left, parents promising their children they would never have to return to this house, voices carrying implications that the Marino twins were dangerous in ways that made association with them unacceptable. The social isolation his sons were creating would follow them into schools and social situations, marking them as problems that other families would avoid rather than embrace. Roman was watching his boys' futures narrow in real time, opportunities closing because their behavior was branding them as unsuitable for the elite circles Roman had spent his life accessing. An elderly woman, someone's grandmother who'd survived wars and revolutions and probably thought she'd seen everything, spoke up from her position near the emergency exit. "Mr. Marino, perhaps this isn't the right time for celebration," she suggested gently, her tone carrying authority that came from decades rather than fear. Sometimes the wisest choice is acknowledging when circumstances require a different approach. But Roman couldn't accept that wisdom, because retreat meant weakness, and weakness invited challenges he couldn't afford. The twins had moved on to the elaborate sound system that had been set up for the entertainment, expensive speakers and equipment that represented the latest technology. Cooper grabbed a microphone and began shrieking into it, the feedback screeching through the ballroom at volumes that made people cover their ears. Carter found the control panel and started pressing buttons randomly, music blaring then cutting off, lights strobing in patterns that turned the elegant space into something resembling a malfunctioning carnival. Roman's carefully constructed mask of control had cracks visible to everyone watching, his jaw working as he ground his teeth hard enough to risk damage. The $1 million offer hung in the air like smoke, unclaimed, and increasingly seeming like it would remain that way, proof that his sons existed beyond the reach of normal incentives. Every second that passed without someone stepping forward to claim the reward hammered home the message that money couldn't fix this. A young woman who worked in child development at a local hospital finally gathered courage to approach Roman rather than the twins, her voice shaking slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Marino, I've seen cases like this before. Children acting out due to trauma or attachment issues that manifest as aggression." She paused, choosing words carefully like navigating a minefield. "Sometimes what they need isn't discipline or control, but connection to something they've lost or never had." Roman stared at her with expression that made the woman take a step backward, his eyes cold enough to freeze water despite the heat of humiliation burning through his chest. "I've given them everything," he said through clenched teeth, the statement emerging as almost accusation rather than explanation. "Private tutors, the best schools, toys they don't even play with, a mansion bigger than most hotels." The unspoken question hung between them. What connection could possibly be missing when every material need had been met? Carter and Cooper had discovered the kitchen service entrance and were now attempting to drag out the industrial-sized refrigerator, their combined strength actually managing to move the appliance. Several servers rushed to intervene, but stopped when the boys turned on them with expressions that promised violence, small hands forming fists that had already proven capable of drawing blood. The refrigerator door swung open, contents spilling across the floor in cascade of expensive ingredients and prepared dishes. Roman watched his sons playing in the wreckage of his celebration, their faces flushed with exertion, and something that might have been joy if it wasn't so disturbing. They looked happy destroying everything around them, like chaos was their natural element, and all his attempts to civilize them had been fighting against their essential nature. The thought made something twist in his chest, because if these boys were truly broken beyond repair, what did that say about him? The annual tradition was approaching, the single minute when Roman allowed the city's homeless to enter his establishment and collect leftovers from his lavish events. It was calculated charity, designed to soften his public image while costing him nothing of real value, scraps thrown to the desperate to buy goodwill. His assistant appeared at his elbow, nervous energy radiating as she checked her watch and waited for permission to open the doors. Roman nodded sharply, not because he cared about maintaining tradition, but because it gave him 60 seconds to think, to regroup, to figure out what came next. The assistant spoke into her radio, and within moments the main entrance doors swung open, revealing the line of ragged figures that had been waiting outside. They shuffled in with heads down, moving quickly toward the ruined buffet tables, aware that their presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The contrast between the elegant guests and the entering homeless was stark enough to feel staged, like two different worlds colliding in the same physical space. Women in designer gowns pressed away from people in layers of torn clothing. Men wearing watches worth 6 figures avoided eye contact with men carrying everything they owned. The twins paused their destruction to watch the newcomers, curiosity replacing aggression for the first time all evening. A woman entered last, moving slower than the others, her gait suggesting exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something that lived in bones and spirit. Her clothes were layered rags held together with safety pins and hope, hair matted into clumps that hung past her shoulders, face half hidden behind tangled strands. She kept her head down like the others, but something in her posture suggested this wasn't submission but rather conservation of energy for survival. The other homeless people moved efficiently, grabbing food and leaving quickly to maximize their haul before the minute expired and doors closed again. But this woman just stood inside the entrance, swaying slightly like a tree in wind, her cracked lips moving in whisper too quiet for anyone nearby to hear. Her hands trembled as she raised them slightly, reaching toward nothing visible, fingers splayed in gesture that might have been plea or prayer. Roman barely noticed her arrival, his attention still focused on his sons who'd finally paused their rampage to watch the homeless collecting food. The sight of poverty seemed to fascinate the twins in a way that expensive entertainment couldn't, their eyes tracking movements of people who existed in a world completely foreign to their experience. For the first time all evening they stood still, their small chests rising and falling from exertion, but their hands empty of weapons. The woman took a shuffling step forward, then another, her path not toward the buffet tables, but toward the center of the room, where destruction lay thickest. Security guards moved to intercept her because homeless people were supposed to take food and leave, not wander deeper into the private celebration. One guard reached out to grab her shoulder, his grip firm but not brutal, intention clear that she needed to redirect toward the exit immediately. She stopped at his touch, her body going rigid beneath layers of fabric, but she didn't turn around or acknowledge him in any normal way. Instead, her head lifted slowly, revealing face that was gaunt with hunger, skin weathered by exposure, eyes that held something between desperation and determination. "Just one plate," she whispered, her voice rough like she hadn't spoken in days, the words emerging with effort that suggested even basic communication required more energy than she had. The guard tightened his grip, preparing to physically steer her toward the door, following protocol that was clear about how long homeless people were permitted inside. But before he could move her, the woman's eyes locked onto something across the room, her entire body tensing in a way that transformed exhaustion into focused intensity. She ignored the guard completely, taking another step forward despite his hand still on her shoulder, compelled by something stronger than self-preservation. Carter and Cooper stood 50 feet away, surrounded by the wreckage they'd created, their small faces smudged with cake and dirt. The woman stared at them with expression that made the security guard pause, something in her face that went beyond normal attention into realm of recognition. Her lips stopped trembling, her hands stopped shaking, and when she moved forward again there was purpose behind it that hadn't existed moments before. "Ma'am, you need to leave," the guard said firmly, his voice carrying authority that usually made people comply immediately, regardless of whether they wanted to. But she didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge his existence, her attention fixed on the twins with laser focus that seemed to burn away everything else. Another guard moved to assist his colleague, 2 grown men preparing to physically remove one malnourished woman from the premises. Roman noticed the commotion and turned, his patience already worn threadbare by the evening's disasters, ready to order the guards to simply carry her out. The 60-second charity window had closed anyway, the other homeless people already gone with their meager takings. tradition fulfilled and reputation maintained. But before he could gesture to his security team, the woman did something that made everyone in the room freeze. She pulled away from the guards with surprising strength, stumbling forward several steps, arms outstretching toward the twins, in gesture that was unmistakably maternal. Her mouth opened, and sound emerged. Not words, but melody. A humming tune that wobbled with emotion and exhaustion, but carried notes that seemed to predate language itself. The sound cut through the aftermath of chaos like light through fog, old and gentle and completely incongruous with surroundings. Carter's head snapped toward her, his body going still in a way that was different from previous pauses, like he'd heard something that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to something deeper. Cooper mirrored his brother's reaction, both boys turning simultaneously toward the woman with expressions that shifted from aggression to confusion to something that looked disturbingly like recognition. They'd never seen her before in their short lives, yet they stared at her like she was answered a question they'd been asking. The guards reached for the woman again, but Roman raised his hand sharply, stopping them mid-motion, his instinct sensing something significant was happening, even if logic couldn't explain what. The ballroom had gone completely silent, 300 people holding collective breath, watching ragged homeless woman and 2 destructive children locked in moment that felt suspended outside normal time. Even the twins' usual manic energy had stilled into something approaching peace. The woman's clothes were layered in a way that suggested she'd been adding garments over time, rather than selecting outfits. Survival strategy for someone who carried everything she owned on her body. Beneath the grime and weathering, her bone structure held traces of beauty that had been eroded by years of hardship. Features that might have been striking before deprivation carved them into something haunted. Her shoes were men's sneakers several sizes too large, held on her feet with plastic bags wrapped around her ankles, improvised solution to footwear that was better than nothing but barely. The details of her poverty were stark against the opulence surrounding her. Contrast so extreme it felt almost staged, except the genuine suffering in her eyes made clear this wasn't performance, but lived reality. Roman noticed that other homeless people had already left with their collected food, efficiency of survival, making them grab what they could and disappear before anything changed. But this woman had violated the unspoken protocol, lingering when she should have fled, moving deeper into the space when she should have been exiting. Her behavior suggested either mental instability or compulsion stronger than self-preservation, something driving her toward the twins that overrode every logical consideration. The security guards exchanged uncertain glances, trained to handle threats, but unsure how to categorize homeless woman who wasn't stealing or causing obvious trouble, just moving with inexplicable determination toward the boss's children. Several guests had pulled out their phones again, sensing that whatever was unfolding might be significant enough to document despite earlier prohibitions on photography. The woman's humming had started low, but was growing in volume and confidence, melody that sounded ancient like it had been passed down through generations rather than composed recently. The tune had no words yet, but the emotional resonance in it was undeniable, something primal that spoke to parts of human experience that predated language. Roman felt the hair on his arms standing up, physiological response to stimuli his conscious mind couldn't fully process, instinct recognizing significance before intellect could catch up. The twins' transformation was happening incrementally, but unmistakably, their aggressive postures softening into something more vulnerable with each step the woman took toward them. Cooper's fists had unclenched, fingers spreading like he was releasing grip on weapons he'd been holding, his breathing slowing from the rapid panting of exertion into calmer rhythm. Carter's face had lost the feral mask it had worn all evening, features rearranging themselves into expression that was heartbreaking in its exposure, all defenses dropping to reveal the frightened child beneath the violence. Whatever this woman was triggering in them was bypassing conscious thought and speaking directly to something deeper, connection that made no logical sense, but was undeniably real. The woman continued humming, taking slow steps toward the boys, each movement careful like she was approaching wild animals that might bolt or attack without warning. Tears had started streaming down her dirty face, cutting clean tracks through grime, but her expression held no fear despite security presence and obvious danger. She looked at Carter and Cooper like they were most precious things in world, like seeing them was worth whatever consequences would follow. Carter took a step toward her, his small foot crunching on broken glass, the sound sharp enough to make several guests flinch. But the boy didn't seem to notice the noise or the danger, or the 300 pairs of eyes watching his every movement. His face had transformed from the feral mask he'd worn all evening into something vulnerable and young, an expression that reminded everyone he was actually just 5 years old, despite the destruction he'd caused. Cooper followed his brother, both twins now walking slowly toward the woman, their synchronized movements no longer threatening, but almost dreamlike in quality. The distance between them closed foot by foot, the woman's humming growing stronger despite her obvious physical weakness, the melody wrapping around the room like invisible thread, pulling everyone toward same central point. Roman felt his chest constrict watching this impossible scene, not understanding what was happening but unable to look away. The woman dropped to her knees when the twins were 10 feet away, bringing herself to their height, arms still outstretched in universal invitation. Her humming shifted into actual words, voice cracking with emotion as she sang fragments of lullaby that sounded ancient, something passed down through generations in whispers and memory. The twins stopped directly in front of her, their small bodies trembling, eyes wide and filling with tears that had nothing to do with anger. Then Carter said word that shattered Roman's world into pieces that could never be reassembled. "Mama." Cooper's voice joined his brother's, the word emerging as sob rather than statement, both boys saying "Mama" in unison, like they'd practiced it in dreams. They launched themselves forward, colliding with the woman's chest hard enough to knock her backward onto the debris-covered floor, their small arms wrapping around her neck with desperate strength. The woman caught them instinctively, her thin arms encircling both boys, pulling them closer despite her obvious weakness, all three of them collapsing into embrace that looked like drowning and salvation happening simultaneously. Roman stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him, because these boys had never said that word before in their entire lives. They'd been raised by nannies and tutors and staff who maintained professional distance, had never attached to anyone enough to claim maternal connection. Yet here they clung to a homeless stranger like she was oxygen itself, their faces buried in her dirty clothing, their small bodies shaking with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than their lungs. The woman was crying too, her hands moving over the twins' heads and backs, touching them like she was confirming they were real and solid, and actually present. "My babies?" she whispered between ragged breaths, the words barely audible but carrying weight that made the air feel heavier. "My sweet babies. Mama found you. Mama's here now." The familiarity in her tone suggested this wasn't first meeting, but reunion, impossible as that seemed given the circumstances. Roman's lieutenant appeared at his elbow, voice urgent and low enough that only his boss could hear the warning. "Sir, should we separate them? This woman could be dangerous. Could be using some kind of manipulation technique to get close to your sons." The concern was valid from security standpoint, yet Roman couldn't bring himself to give the order, couldn't force himself to tear apart the scene unfolding before him. Carter pulled back slightly to look at the woman's face, his small hands reaching up to touch her hollow cheeks with gentleness that seemed impossible for someone who'd been violent minutes earlier. "Where were you?" he asked, his child's voice cracking with emotion too complex for his age. "We waited and waited, but you never came." The accusation in his words suggested memory that couldn't possibly exist, knowledge of absence that defied logic. Cooper was examining the woman's hands, holding them up and tracing the calluses and scars with his tiny fingers, like he was reading story written in damaged flesh. "You're hurt," he said with concern that transformed his face into something heartbreaking, all traces of the monster from earlier erased completely. "Who hurt you, Mama? We'll make them stop." The protective instinct in his declaration would have been touching if it wasn't coming from 5-year-old who didn't know this woman. The woman shook her head, fresh tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling through the grief and expression that held both joy and unbearable sadness. "Nobody hurt me, my darlings. Mama just had to be away for a while, but I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped loving you every single day." Her words were directed at the twins, but her eyes lifted briefly to find Roman across the room, and the look she gave him carried accusation sharp enough to draw blood. Roman's legs felt unstable beneath him, the marble floor seeming to tilt as pieces of impossible puzzle began arranging themselves in his mind. The woman's age was hard to determine beneath the weathering of street life, but something in her bone structure, the shape of her eyes, struck chord of terrible familiarity. His thoughts rewound 5 years, to woman he'd known briefly, intensely, woman he'd discarded when she became inconvenient to his carefully planned life. "Addison," he said, the name emerging as barely whisper, but in the silent ballroom it carried like gunshot, making several guests gasp audibly. The woman's head turned toward him slowly, her eyes meeting his directly for first time since she'd entered, and Roman saw truth reflected there that made his chest cavity feel like it was collapsing. This wasn't stranger manipulating his sons. This was their mother, the woman he'd thrown away along with the pregnancy he'd refused to acknowledge. The timeline assembled itself with brutal clarity. 5 years since he'd last seen Addison Reed. 5 years since he'd told her that children from Mistress had no place in his world. Exactly 5 years since Carter and Cooper had been born. The twins had appeared on his doorstep in basket, with notes saying their mother had died in childbirth, delivered by intermediary who'd vanished before questions could be asked. Roman had accepted the story because it was convenient, had raised the boys because they were his blood, had never questioned the narrative that kept his conscience clean. But Addison wasn't dead. She was kneeling on his ballroom floor, holding the sons she'd supposedly abandoned, alive and breathing and clearly devastated by reunion. Roman's world tilted on its axis, as he realized the basket story had been lie, that someone had stolen these babies and delivered them to their father while leaving mother alive but empty-armed. His mind immediately jumped to his own mother, the woman who'd never approved of Addison, who'd considered her unsuitable match for future of the Merino Empire. Addison seemed to read his thoughts in his expression, because she gave small, bitter laugh that held no humor. She took them from the hospital while I was still unconscious from emergency cesarean, she said loud enough for nearby guests to hear, her voice gaining strength from fury that had apparently survived 5 years of suffering. I woke up and they told me my babies were in NICU, but when I went to see them they were gone, just vanished, and nobody had any records, any explanations. Roman's mother had died 2 years ago, taking her secrets to grave that now felt like deliberate middle finger to truth. There would be no confrontation, no demands for explanation, just the hollow certainty that the woman who'd raised him had committed theft so profound that it poisoned everything built on top of it. The twins in his home, the heirs he'd been preparing, were products of crime that had destroyed their mother while he'd remained ignorantly complicit. I searched everywhere, Addison continued, her arms tightening around the boys who clung to her like they'd never let go. Police told me I was unstable. That postpartum depression was making me imagine babies that never existed. They had me committed for 3 months, and when I got out, I had nothing. No job, no home, no credibility. Her voice broke on the last word, years of accumulated injustice pouring out in front of audience that included the city's most powerful people. Roman took a step toward her, then another, his usual confident stride replaced by uncertain shuffle of man walking through ruins of his own making. I didn't know, he said, the words inadequate and pathetic, excuse that couldn't possibly cover the magnitude of what had been done. I was told you died, that the babies were delivered to me because you'd named me on the birth certificate before you passed. The explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears, willful ignorance dressed up as innocent victim. Addison's eyes hardened as she looked at him. Maternal softness she'd shown the twins replaced by contempt sharp enough to cut. You threw me out when I told you I was pregnant, she said flatly, stating facts without embellishment, because the truth needed no decoration. You said children from mistresses were mistakes to be cleaned up, not legitimized. You offered me money to disappear and never contact you again. The guests stirred uncomfortably, whispers spreading like wildfire. But Roman couldn't bring himself to care about reputation when facing the wreckage of his choices. Carter and Cooper were looking between their father and the woman they'd called Mama, confusion evident on their faces, but their bodies remained pressed against Addison's. You made her go away? Carter asked his father, his small voice carrying accusation that was somehow worse than adult judgment. You made Mama leave us? The betrayal in his tone suggested these boys had been searching for something they couldn't name, acting out because of hole they couldn't understand, and now they knew who was responsible for the emptiness. Roman's knees buckled and he sank to the floor, expensive suit trousers grinding into broken glass and spilled food, physical pain barely registering against emotional devastation. I didn't know she was alive, he repeated, the defense sounding weaker with each repetition, but it was all he had. I would have searched for her if I'd known, would have brought her back to you if I'd understood. But even as he spoke, he wondered if that was true, if the man he'd been 5 years ago would have chosen differently, even with complete information. Addison shifted her weight, preparing to stand while keeping the twins held against her, her malnourished body trembling with effort of supporting 2 5-year-olds and her own frame simultaneously. Several guests moved forward instinctively to help, but stopped when she shot them looks that made clear she wanted nothing from anyone in this room. She managed to get to her feet through sheer determination, Carter and Cooper refusing to release their grip on her, their faces still buried in her shoulder and neck. Roman remained on his knees, head bowed, shoulders shaking in a way that was foreign to everyone who'd ever known him as unbreakable force. Tears fell onto marble floor, mixing with champagne and frosting. The sight of the Merino boss crying in public so unprecedented that several people pulled out phones before remembering that photographing this moment would be suicide. His carefully constructed armor of control had shattered completely, leaving him exposed in a way that was almost painful to witness. "I lived on streets for 5 years, Addison said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom, testimony delivered to crowd that represented the world that had discarded her. "I begged for change, slept in shelters when there was space, ate from dumpsters when there wasn't. Every day I looked at children playing in parks, wondering if I'd recognize my babies if I saw them, wondering if they were safe or if they even existed." The raw honesty in her words made several women in the audience wipe their own eyes, sympathy crossing class barriers that usually kept such emotions separate. Roman's lieutenant approached cautiously, clearly unsure of protocol when the boss was having complete breakdown in front of 300 witnesses. "Sir, perhaps we should move this somewhere more private," he suggested quietly, offering escape route from public humiliation that was growing worse with every passing second. But Roman shook his head sharply, understanding on some instinctual level that this moment needed to be public, needed to be witnessed by people who'd benefit from watching him brought low. Cooper pulled back from Addison enough to look at his father, still kneeling on the floor, the boy's expression complex mixture of confusion and nascent understanding. "Why are you crying?" he asked, childish directness cutting through adult complications to heart of matter. "Are you sad because Mama was lost?" The innocence in his question somehow made Roman's breakdown more complete, because even 5-year-old could see the tragedy that Roman's choices had created. Carter was still examining Addison's face, his small hands touching her cheeks and forehead like he was memorizing every detail, afraid she might vanish if he stopped maintaining physical contact. "Are you staying now?" he asked, voice small and uncertain in a way that was heartbreaking given his usual aggression. "Can you live with us and never leave again?" The hope in his question was so fragile, it seemed like wrong answer might shatter him into pieces that couldn't be reassembled. Addison closed her eyes, more tears squeezing out and running down her face, her jaw working as she tried to form answer to question that had no simple solution. "I don't know, sweet boy," she finally whispered, honesty apparently more important to her than comfort. "I don't know if staying with your father is right thing for any of us." Her gaze lifted to find Roman again, assessment in her eyes that was calculating whether man who'd thrown her away could possibly be trusted with second chance. Roman found his voice, words emerging rough and broken but audible to everyone watching this impossible reunion. "Please," he said, single syllable carrying more genuine emotion than most of his speeches combined. "Please don't take them from me. I know I have no right to ask. No, I destroyed everything before it could even begin. But they're my sons too." The plea was selfish, focused on his own loss rather than her suffering, and Addison's expression hardened slightly at the self-centered nature of his begging. "You gave up the right to call them yours when you told me to terminate the pregnancy," Addison said sharply, her tone cutting through sentiment with blade of remembered pain. "You didn't want them then, only accepted them when they appeared convenient and motherless. Now you're afraid of losing what you never valued until it was destroying your reputation." The accuracy of her assessment made Roman flinch, truth landing like physical blows that left marks invisible to everyone but him. The twins were watching this exchange with wide eyes, their young minds struggling to process adult conflict that was reshaping their entire understanding of family. Carter's face was scrunched in concentration, clearly trying to understand why the father he'd known would hurt the mother he'd instinctively recognized. Cooper had started crying again, overwhelmed by emotions he didn't have language to express, his small body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere too deep for his age. Roman crawled forward on hands and knees, closing distance between himself and Addison, despite her obvious desire for space, desperate need for proximity, overriding remaining dignity. "I was wrong," he said, voice cracking on each word. Confession that cost him everything, because Roman Merino never admitted mistakes. "I was selfish and cruel, and I destroyed lives because I was too afraid to let anything matter more than control. But those boys, our boys, they've been destroying everything around them because they knew something was missing, because they could feel the hole where you should have been." Addison's expression shifted slightly, anger giving way to something more complex as she processed his words and looked down at the twins still pressed against her. "They've been acting out?" she asked quietly, maternal concern overriding personal grievances in instant, her focus shifting to what children had experienced rather than what she'd endured. The question revealed something fundamental about her character, that her baby's well-being mattered more than her own justified rage. Violent, Roman admitted, shame evident in his tone as he confessed failures as father. Uncontrollable, aggressive, impossible to reach no matter what we tried. Specialists said they'd never seen children so young, so capable of calculated destruction. He gestured weakly at the demolished ballroom around them, evidence of his son's rage displayed like modern art installation. Tonight was worst it's ever been, until you walked in and they just stopped. The implication hung in the air, that these boys had been searching for their mother without knowing what they were searching for, that their violence was grief expressing itself through only channels available to children too young to understand their own trauma. Addison's face crumpled as she processed this information, realization that her sons had suffered because of crimes committed against all of them, adding new layer to pain she'd already been carrying. Her arms tightened around Carter and Cooper, pulling them closer as if she could protect them retroactively from years of damage. "How long?" she asked, voice barely above whisper, but carrying across the silent room. How long were they like this before tonight? The question held dread, fear of learning that children had been in pain for months or years, while she'd been surviving on streets, unaware that babies she'd been stolen from her were suffering their own form of abandonment. Roman's face answered before his words could, guilt written so clearly in his expression that Addison gasped audibly. "Since they could walk," he admitted, each word extracted like pulling teeth without anesthesia. Small things at first, pushing nannies, breaking toys, refusing to bond with anyone. But it got worse as they got older, more intentional, more destructive. He looked at his sons with mixture of love and grief that was painful to witness. "I thought it was genetic, that they'd inherited something dark from my side of the family. I never considered that maybe they were just looking for you." Carter chose that moment to speak up, his child's voice cutting through heavy adult emotions with simple truth. "We had bad dreams," he said quietly, face still pressed against Addison's shoulder. "Every night, about Lady who sang to us. We could never see her face, but we knew we needed to find her." Cooper nodded agreement, both boys describing shared experience that suggested connection to mother that transcended normal memory, bond that had survived separation and time. Addison's legs finally gave out, exhaustion and emotional overload combining to rob her of remaining strength, and she sank back to the floor with the twins still clutched against her chest. Several guests moved forward to help, but Roman's sharp gesture stopped them, some protective instinct emerging that said this woman had right to collapse without audience trying to manage her breakdown. She sat among the debris of the destroyed party, her ragged clothes spreading around her like tattered wings, and just held her sons while crying silently. Roman remained on his knees several feet away, maintaining distance she clearly needed, while visibly struggling with desire to close the gap and beg for forgiveness he didn't deserve. His security team hovered uncertainly at the perimeter, trained to handle threats but completely unprepared for their boss's emotional destruction in public forum. The 300 guests had become unwilling witnesses to private tragedy, most looking away as if that would grant family some dignity in moment that had none. Cooper had stopped crying and was now playing with strand of Addison's matted hair, his small fingers working through the tangles with gentle patience that contradicted his earlier violence. "Your hair is messy," he observed with child's blunt honesty, statement carrying no judgment, just factual assessment. "We have people who can fix it. And you need bath, because you smell like the scary place under the bridge." Carter nodded agreement, both boys apparently unaware that their observations might be hurtful. Addison laughed, sound emerging as half-sob, but holding genuine amusement at her son's candor. "You're right, I do smell bad," she agreed, pulling back to look at both boys with expression that held infinite tenderness. "Mama hasn't had proper bath in very long time, but maybe that can wait little bit while I just look at you both. I've been dreaming about your faces for 5 years, and I want to make sure I remember everything." Her hands moved over their features, touching with reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Roman cleared his throat, the sound loud enough to draw attention but not demanding it, his usual commanding presence reduced to hesitant supplication. "You can stay here," he said carefully, each word chosen with unprecedented caution. "The mansion has 20 bedrooms. You and the boys can have entire wing to yourselves. Whatever you need, clothes, food, medical care, everything is yours without conditions or expectations." The offer was generous, but his tone made clear it was plea rather than transaction. Addison's eyes found his across the space separating them, assessment in her gaze that was measuring whether accepting would make her complicit in her own continued victimization. Separate wing? She repeated, testing the boundaries of his offer. You're saying I can be there as their mother, but not as anything to you? No strings, no expectations that I'll fall back into whatever role you might imagine for me? The sharpness in her questions made several guests wince, but Roman nodded eagerly. Whatever terms you want, he confirmed, desperation evident in his willingness to accept any arrangement that kept his sons within reach. You can lock the doors. Have your own security if it makes you feel safer. I'll sleep in the office, the garage, anywhere you want, as long as I can still see them sometimes. The complete surrender of man who'd never compromised on anything was stunning to everyone who knew his reputation, watching the Merino boss reduce himself to nothing in attempt to prevent losing what he'd only just discovered he valued. Carter and Cooper exchanged glances, silent communication passing between them that twins sometimes share, before Carter spoke up with question that cut to heart of situation. If Mama stays, will you be nice to her? He asked his father, small face serious beyond his years. Because if you're mean, we'll break more stuff, we'll break everything. The threat would have been cute, if not for the evening's evidence that these boys could absolutely follow through on promise. Roman's face crumpled at his son's words, understanding that he'd not only lost trust of woman he'd wronged, but also somehow earned the conditional loyalty of children who were prepared to wage war on his behalf against him. I will never be mean to your mama again, he promised, voice thick with emotion that made the words almost unintelligible. I will spend rest of my life trying to fix what I broke, trying to give back even fraction of what I took from all of you. The declaration was witnessed by 300 people who would carry this story into world, forever changing how Roman Merino was perceived by those who trafficked in power and reputation. Addison studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, before turning her attention back to the twins who were her primary concern, regardless of their father's redemption arc. Do you boys want Mama to come home with you? She asked, giving them choice and decision that would reshape all their lives, even if it means things might be complicated and confusing for a while. Both boys nodded vigorously, their enthusiasm unmistakable, despite limited understanding of what complications might entail. Then I'll come, Addison decided, her voice carrying resignation mixed with fierce determination. But not for him, for you two, because you deserve to have mother, and I deserve to finally be able to raise the babies that were stolen from me. She looked at Roman directly, her eyes hard, despite the tears still streaming down her face. You can be their father from distance. You can provide resources and security and whatever material things you're good at, but don't expect forgiveness, don't expect relationship. Don't expect anything beyond coexistence in service of these boys. Roman nodded acceptance of terms that relegated him to peripheral role in his own home, his own family, understanding that this was more than he deserved and better than he'd feared. Thank you, he whispered, gratitude evident in every syllable, despite knowing that what he'd gained was shadow of what he'd destroyed. I'll have rooms prepared immediately. Everything you need brought in before morning. He pulled out his phone with hands that shook slightly, already making arrangements while trying not to notice the way Addison flinched at his movements like she expected violence. The head of security approached again, this time directing his attention to Addison rather than Roman. Ma'am, would you like separate security detail? People you can trust who report only to you? The offer was unexpected, suggestion that Roman's own team was prioritizing her safety over their boss's control, and Roman's slight nod confirmed he'd already given these orders. Addison looked surprised, but after moments' consideration, she nodded acceptance, understanding that protection might be necessary in the world she was entering. Carter and Cooper helped their mother stand, both boys supporting her despite their small size, their earlier violence completely absent as they focused on caring for the woman they'd recognized without explanation. Addison swayed slightly, malnutrition and exhaustion catching up with her now that adrenaline was fading, but she remained upright through sheer determination. Roman moved to help, but stopped when she shot him, look that made clear his touch wasn't welcome, boundary established without words that he needed to respect. The 300 guests watched as the unlikely family group moved toward the exit, homeless woman flanked by 2 5-year-olds, trailed by father who'd been reduced to stranger in his own legacy. Whispers had started already, speculation about what this meant for Roman's empire, for his reputation, for power structures that depended on his unshakable authority. But Roman didn't look back at the people whose opinions had once mattered more than truth, his attention fixed on the small family ahead of him that he was trying desperately not to lose again. As they reached the doorway, Carter turned back to look at the destroyed ballroom, the wreckage that he and his brother had created, and his young face showed something like understanding. "We were angry," he said simply. Explanation offered to room full of people who'd witnessed their rage. "We didn't know why, but now we do. We were angry because she wasn't there." Cooper nodded agreement, both boys apparently satisfied that their violence had finally been explained. Mystery solved, even if damage remained. Roman remained behind as his family left, standing alone in the center of destruction, while guests began filing out in uncomfortable silence. Night's celebration transformed into tragedy that no one knew how to process. The lieutenant approached once the crowd had thinned, his expression careful as he waited for instructions about cleanup and damage control. But Roman just stared at the empty doorway where Addison and the boys had disappeared, his face reflecting understanding that some things couldn't be cleaned up or controlled. Some consequences had to simply be endured. The mansion's east wing had been transformed overnight into space that bore no resemblance to the rest of Roman's carefully curated empire of dark wood and leather. Staff had worked through the night painting walls in soft yellows and blues, installing furniture that was comfortable rather than impressive, creating an environment that felt like home rather than museum. Roman had given explicit instructions that nothing should feel institutional or cold, that every choice should prioritize comfort for women who'd been sleeping on concrete for 5 years. Addison stood in the doorway of the master bedroom. Carter and Cooper pressed against her legs, all three of them staring at the space like it might disappear if they looked away. The bed was enormous, piled with pillows and blankets that looked impossibly soft. Attached bathroom visible through open door showed tub large enough to swim in. "This is too much," Addison whispered, her voice carrying disbelief that bordered on suspicion. Years of deprivation making luxury feel like trap rather than gift. Roman hovered in the hallway, respecting the boundary of the threshold he'd been told not to cross, his hands shoved deep in his pockets to keep from reaching out. "It's not enough," he said quietly, statement of fact rather than false modesty. "Nothing I could give you would be enough to balance what was taken, but please let me try anyway." His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, suggesting he'd been awake coordinating preparations rather than sleeping, penance enacted through action rather than words. Carter pulled away from his mother long enough to explore the room, his small hands touching everything with reverence that was startling given his destructive tendencies hours earlier. He found a bookshelf filled with children's stories, brand new volumes with uncracked spines waiting to be read, and his face lit up with delight. "Mama, look! Books for bedtime!" Cooper joined him immediately, both boys rifling through titles with excitement that suggested they'd never had consistent bedtime stories. Neglect that added another item to list of Roman's failures. Addison moved to join her sons, her gait still unsteady, but strengthening as basic needs like safety and shelter began registering in her exhausted body. She pulled a book from the shelf, and her breath caught audibly, tears springing to her eyes as she recognized the title. "This was my favorite as a child," she said, voice breaking on the words. "My mother used to read it to me every night before she died." The fact that Roman had somehow known this detail was evident in his expression. He'd researched her, learned about her past, tried to recreate pieces of home she'd lost. Roman shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, the intensity of her emotion making him acutely aware of how much he'd stolen and how little he could restore. "I had people find out what might matter to you," he admitted, careful not to make his efforts sound manipulative, even though the line between thoughtfulness and control was thin. "I wanted you to have things that felt familiar, not just expensive." The distinction seemed important to him, though whether Addison appreciated the difference was unclear from her carefully neutral expression. The boys had discovered the closet, doors sliding open to reveal racks of clothing in Addison's size, casual comfortable pieces mixed with formal options, shoes arranged by type and season. Cooper pulled out a soft sweater and brought it to his mother, holding it up against her ragged layers. "You can throw away the smelly clothes now," he announced with child's practical logic. "These are new and they don't have holes." Carter nodded agreement, already selecting more items to show her. Both boys apparently excited about the prospect of their mother looking less like the homeless woman they'd found, and more like the mothers they'd seen in books. Addison accepted the sweater with trembling hands, the soft fabric foreign against her calloused fingers, her eyes welling up again at the simple gesture of her sons, wanting her to have nice things. "Maybe after bath," she said, voice thick with emotion she was barely containing. "Mama needs to wash away a lot of dirt before she can wear anything this clean." The self-deprecating statement held pain that went beyond physical grime, Years of degradation that couldn't be scrubbed away with soap and water alone. Roman stepped back from the threshold, creating more space even though he hadn't been physically crowding the doorway. "The bathroom has everything you might need," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the attached room. "Staff can help if you want, or I can have them wait outside if you prefer privacy. Whatever makes you comfortable." The careful attention to her autonomy suggested he was trying to learn from past mistakes, though whether she trusted his reformation was question that hung unanswered in the air between them. Carter tugged on his father's sleeve, drawing Roman's attention down to his son's upturned face. "Are you going to stay with us while Mama takes bath?" he asked, innocent question that held weight of needing reassurance that this new family configuration was stable. "Or are you going away again?" The fear in his voice suggested these boys had experienced too many people disappearing from their lives, abandonment issues that would take years to heal if they ever did. Roman knelt to his son's level, bringing himself down to where he could look Carter in the eyes directly. "I'm going to my office down the hall," he explained gently, pointing in the direction he meant. "But I'm not leaving the house, and you can come find me anytime you want. I'll always be close enough to reach if you need me." The promise was simple, but given with solemnity, that suggested he understood the significance, that he was making commitment he intended to keep regardless of personal cost. Cooper joined his brother, both boys studying their father's face with intensity that suggested they were memorizing his features, cataloging his expressions against some internal measurement of trustworthiness. "What if we need you at night?" Cooper asked, his voice smaller than usual. "What if we have the bad dreams again and we can't find you?" The vulnerability in his question revealed how much damage their years of unexplained absence had caused, how deeply the twins' aggression had been rooted in fear. Roman's chest tightened painfully at his son's words, understanding that he was being given chance to provide stability he'd never bothered offering before. "Then you come wake me up," he said firmly, reaching out to touch Cooper's shoulder with gentleness that looked unpracticed. "You knock on my door as loud as you want, and I'll come right away. No one will ever tell you that you're bothering me, or that you need to handle things alone." The promise felt like vow, commitment that was being witnessed by Addison, even if she didn't acknowledge hearing it. Addison had been watching this exchange with expression that cycled through emotions too quickly to name, hope and suspicion, and grief all competing for dominance. "They can sleep in here with me tonight," she said, statement rather than request, making clear that she wasn't ready to trust Roman with unsupervised time with the boys yet. "We have lot of catching up to do. Lot of years to make up for." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it was firm, boundary established that Roman needed to respect even if it hurt. Roman nodded acceptance, rising back to his full height while trying not to show the rejection that her words had triggered. "Of course," he agreed, backing toward the hallway. "You need time together, time to rebuild what was taken from you. I'll have dinner sent up around 6, but if you need anything before then, just press the button by the bed and someone will come immediately." He was retreating, but doing it with grace, giving them space while making sure they knew they weren't abandoned. Carter and Cooper ran to hug their father suddenly, small arms wrapping around his legs with force that nearly knocked him off balance. "Thank you for bringing Mama home," Carter said, voice muffled against Roman's thigh. Cooper echoed the sentiment, both boys showing affection that Roman hadn't experienced from them in their entire 5 years of life. The embrace lasted only seconds before they released him and ran back to Addison, but those seconds felt like absolution. Roman knew he didn't deserve, but desperately needed anyway. Roman left them there, closing the door behind him with quiet click that somehow felt louder than any slam could have been. He stood in the hallway for a long moment, forehead pressed against expensive wallpaper, breathing controlled to prevent breakdown that threatened to overwhelm his already fractured composure. The sound of water running in the bathroom reached him through the door, Addison drawing bath, beginning process of washing away 5 years of street survival, and Roman felt weight of what he'd done settle onto his shoulders with crushing finality. The walk to his office felt longer than it was, each step carrying him further from the family he was trying to rebuild, and closer to the isolation he'd earned through his choices. His lieutenant was waiting outside the office door, tablet in hand with reports about damage control from the previous night's disaster. But Roman waved him away without looking at the screen, uninterested in managing public perception when private reality was still bleeding from wounds he'd inflicted. The man retreated quickly, recognizing that his boss was in no condition to discuss business regardless of how urgent the matters might be. 6 weeks passed in strange rhythm of proximity and distance, Addison and the twins occupying the east wing, while Roman haunted the rest of the mansion like ghost in his own home. He saw his sons at carefully scheduled times: breakfast 3 mornings a week, afternoon activities on weekends, supervised visits where Addison remained present to ensure nothing inappropriate occurred. The boys thrived under their mother's attention, their violence vanishing so completely it seemed like bad dream, rather than reality everyone had endured. Addison had gained weight, her hollow cheeks filling out with regular meals, her skin losing the weathered appearance that years of exposure had carved into her features. She wore the clothes Roman had provided but altered them herself, sewing on patches and changing buttons like she needed to mark them as hers, rather than gifts from him. The gesture felt like small rebellion, maintaining independence even while accepting charity, and Roman understood the need even if it stung to watch her reject the pristine versions he'd offered. Roman had moved into his office permanently, sleeping on the leather couch that was too short for his frame, waking with back pain that felt like appropriate punishment. He showered in the executive bathroom and dressed in suits kept in the closet there, existing in professional space because his personal rooms felt too far from the East Wing. The staff whispered about the arrangement, but no one dared comment directly, watching their boss transform from untouchable authority into man who seemed to be serving penance for unnamed crimes. Carter and Cooper had started calling him Dad instead of Father, small shift in language that suggested growing comfort with his presence. They'd initiated physical contact, holding his hand during walks, sitting on his lap during story time, affection that was freely given rather than demanded. Roman treasured each touch like precious metal, aware that these boys had every reason to hate him, but were choosing connection instead, generosity that humbled him more effectively than any punishment could have. Addison watched these interactions with unreadable expression, never interfering, but never fully approving either. She'd spoken to Roman only when necessary, conversations limited to logistics about the boys' schedules and needs, her tone remaining coolly professional despite their shared history. Roman didn't push for more, understanding that trust couldn't be demanded or purchased, that if reconciliation ever happened it would be on her timeline according to her terms. The waiting felt like torture, but he endured it because alternative was unthinkable. The boys had stopped having nightmares completely, sleeping through nights in their mother's bed without the screaming terrors that had plagued them since infancy. Addison sang to them every evening, the same lullaby she'd hummed in the ballroom, her voice gaining strength and melody as her body healed. Roman sometimes stood in the hallway outside their door, listening to the singing through the wood, his chest aching with knowledge that this was what he'd destroyed 5 years ago, when he'd chosen pride over love. Addison had started therapy, sessions twice a week with specialists in trauma, who visited the mansion, rather than requiring her to venture into public yet. Roman paid the bills without comment, understanding that healing would require professional help beyond what family support could provide. The therapist had suggested eventually including him in sessions to address the harm he'd caused, but Addison had refused firmly, not ready to share her processing with the person who'd created the need for it. Roman accepted the rejection without argument, adding it to growing list of consequences he was learning to endure. The twins' 5th birthday had passed again. Quiet celebration in the East Wing with cake Addison baked herself using the kitchen staff's help. Roman had been invited to attend for 30 minutes, standing awkwardly in the corner while his sons blew out candles and opened presents their mother had chosen. He'd brought gifts too, but they remained wrapped in his office. Uncertainty about whether offering them would feel like attempted purchase of affection, making him second-guess the gesture until it was too late. The isolation at his son's celebration felt worse than the public humiliation of their original party, private exile that cut deeper than any crowd's judgment. Carter had started asking questions about why his parents didn't talk to each other. 5-year-old's observation skills, detecting tension that adults thought they were hiding. "Don't you like Mama?" he'd asked Roman during one of their supervised visits. Small face, serious with concern. "She's nice now that she's not sad and dirty. You should be friends." The innocent suggestion had made Roman's throat close up, because explaining adult complications to child who just wanted his family to be unified felt impossible without causing more harm. Roman had tried to answer honestly without burdening his son with inappropriate details, choosing words carefully. "I like your mama very much," he'd said, voice rough with emotion. "But sometimes grown-ups hurt each other badly, and it takes long time before they can be close again. Mama needs space from me right now, and that's okay because what matters is that you boys are happy." Carter had seemed satisfied with this explanation, wandering off to play, but the conversation had haunted Roman for days afterward. Addison had started venturing outside the mansion, short walks in the garden with the boys running ahead of her on the manicured paths. Roman watched from his office window, observing the way she moved with increasing confidence, shoulders straightening as her body remembered how to exist without constant threat. She never looked up at his window, but he suspected she knew he was there, performing her recovery for audience of one who had no right to witness it, but couldn't look away. The staff had developed dual loyalties, serving Roman as employer, while clearly aligning themselves emotionally with Addison as wronged party. They brought her extra desserts and fresh flowers, spent time teaching her to use the house's technology, treated her with respect that went beyond professional courtesy into genuine affection. Roman appreciated their defection, even as it emphasized his isolation, understanding that Addison deserved advocates in his home since she had no reason to trust anyone connected to him. Cooper had mentioned casually during breakfast that Mama cried sometimes at night when she thought the boys were sleeping. "She tries to be quiet, but I hear her," he'd reported with child's blunt honesty. "She says she's okay, but her face is wet." The information had devastated Roman, confirmation that Addison's healing was an ongoing process rather than completed event, that his actions had created damage that would take years to repair if it ever fully could be. Roman had started attending therapy himself, different specialist in separate office, working through guilt and shame that had accumulated over 6 weeks of witnessing consequences of his choices. The therapist had suggested he write letter to Addison even if he never gave it to her, processing his feelings in form that didn't demand her emotional labor. Roman had tried several times, filling pages with apologies and explanations, but each attempt felt inadequate, so they all ended up shredded in his office trash, words insufficient to bridge gap he'd created. The twins' routine doctor visit had revealed they were behind on developmental milestones, speech and social skills delayed in ways that suggested neglect, despite Roman's expensive tutors and programs. Addison had taken the news with visible pain, understanding that her absence had cost her sons more than just her presence, that they'd suffered measurable harm during years she'd been fighting to survive on streets. Roman had offered to hire additional specialists, but she'd wanted to work with the boys herself first, maternal instinct insisting she could provide what they needed better than any professional. Roman had stood outside the pediatrician's office during that appointment, not welcome in the exam room but unable to leave the building, pacing the parking lot like expectant father from previous generation. When Addison emerged with the boys, her face had been composed, but her eyes were red-rimmed with recently shed tears. He'd wanted to offer comfort, but her body language made clear that sympathy from him would be unwelcome, so he'd just opened the car door and driven them home in silence, heavy with shared grief over what had been lost. The boys had started asking when Mama would move into a different room, confusion evident about why she needed entire wing to herself. Is she afraid of the dark? Carter had asked Roman during tucked-in routine he'd been invited to perform. We could get nightlights for other bedrooms too, if that would help. The innocent misunderstanding of why Addison maintained such firm boundaries had made Roman's heart clench with awareness of how much his sons didn't know about the history that shaped their present. Month 3 brought subtle shifts in atmosphere, frost between Roman and Addison thawing so incrementally it was barely noticeable until warmth appeared unexpectedly. She'd thanked him for arranging specialist tutor for Cooper's speech delay, actual gratitude in her voice rather than grudging acknowledgement. Roman had accepted the thanks with quiet nod, not wanting to make excessive production out of moment that felt fragile enough to shatter with wrong response. The boys had noticed the civil exchange and their faces had lit up like Christmas morning, hope visible that perhaps their fractured family might eventually find configuration that included everyone. Addison had started joining them for dinner twice a week, sitting at opposite end of the long dining table with boys between them like buffer zone. Conversations remained focused on Carter and Cooper, neutral territory where parents could interact without addressing personal history, but the meals were peaceful in a way that felt almost normal. Roman caught himself looking forward to these dinners with anticipation that was painful in its intensity. 2 hours of proximity to the woman he'd wronged feeling like undeserved gift he was afraid to acknowledge in case it disappeared. The breaking point came on unremarkable Tuesday evening when Cooper fell during playtime and split his forehead on corner of coffee table. Blood poured from the wound in a way that made everyone panic, Addison rushing to apply pressure while Carter screamed in sympathetic terror. Roman appeared from his office within seconds, assessing the injury with calm that came from years of managing crises, his hands gentle as he examined his son's wound. "He needs stitches," he'd announced, already reaching for his phone to call their private physician, and Addison hadn't argued with his authority in that moment. They'd ridden to the emergency clinic together, Addison in back seat holding Cooper, while Carter clung to his father in front passenger seat. Family unit united by crisis in way that ordinary moments hadn't achieved. Roman drove with careful speed, breaking traffic laws he'd normally ignore to get his son medical attention quickly, and Addison didn't comment on the liberties he took because maternal concern overrode everything else. The waiting room had been nearly empty, their arrival prompting immediate service that money and influence purchased. Cooper whisked away to treatment room with parents flanking his bed. The boy had been brave during stitches, gripping both his parents' hands while doctor worked, his tears silent and his body still despite obvious pain. Roman and Addison had maintained their grips on opposite sides of the bed, providing twin sources of comfort, their hands nearly touching across their son's small torso. When procedure was finished, and Cooper had exhausted himself into sleep with pain medication's help, Roman and Addison had remained in those positions, neither willing to release the physical connection that crisis had created. Addison had been first to speak, her voice soft in the dim hospital room. "Thank you for being calm," she'd said, words emerging with difficulty like they were being extracted. "I was too scared to think clearly, and you just handled it." The admission felt significant. Acknowledgement that Roman had value beyond his financial resources, that his presence had mattered in moment of genuine need rather than orchestrated gesture. Roman had nodded wordlessly, not trusting himself to speak without emotion overwhelming his carefully maintained composure. The drive home had been quieter, Carter asleep in back seat next to his medicated brother, parents sitting in front with space between them that felt less hostile than it had hours earlier. Roman had turned on radio to fill the silence, classical music filling the car at low volume, and Addison hadn't objected to his choice. They'd carried the boys upstairs together, working in unspoken coordination to settle them into Addison's bed, tucking blankets around small bodies with shared tenderness that felt almost like partnership. Addison had lingered in the doorway after Roman had kissed the boys goodnight, her expression uncertain in a way he hadn't seen since she'd arrived. "Would you want to have coffee?" she'd asked, words tumbling out quickly like she might lose courage if she didn't speak immediately. "Just coffee in the kitchen, to decompress from tonight. Nothing more than that." The clarification felt necessary, establishing boundaries even while extending olive branch, and Roman had accepted the offer with gratitude he tried to keep from showing too obviously. They'd sat at the kitchen island, staff dismissed for privacy, mugs of coffee growing cold between them as words finally emerged, after months of careful silence. Addison had talked about her years on streets, sanitized version that avoided worse details but conveyed essential truth of her survival. Roman had listened without interrupting, bearing witness to suffering he'd caused indirectly, accepting responsibility even when she didn't explicitly assign it. The conversation had lasted until dawn crept through windows, neither of them willing to end the connection that was finally forming. Roman had confessed his mother's role in the baby's disappearance, evidence he'd found in her papers after her death, confirmation that Addison's suspicions had been accurate. "I didn't know until month after you arrived," he'd admitted, shame evident in his inability to meet her eyes. "I found documents showing payments to hospital staff, instructions for delivery of the twins to my address with fabricated death certificate for you. She did it because she thought you were unsuitable, that you'd corrupt the family legacy." The revelation had made Addison cry angry tears that she didn't bother hiding. Grief for injustice finally validated mixing with rage that had nowhere to go since perpetrator was already dead. Addison had asked why he'd thrown her out when she told him about pregnancy, question she'd clearly been holding since the ballroom reunion. Roman had tried to explain his younger self's priorities, empire building and reputation management, that had seemed more important than human connection, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I was afraid," he'd finally admitted, stripping away justifications to reach uncomfortable truth. "Afraid of needing you more than you needed me. Afraid of creating family that could become leverage against me. Afraid of anything that made me vulnerable." The honesty had cost him something to speak aloud, defenses dropping to reveal the insecurity beneath his carefully constructed power. The conversation had ended without resolution, but with understanding. Gap between them, not bridged, but at least measured and acknowledged. Addison had retreated to her wing as sun rose fully, leaving Roman in the kitchen with cold coffee and exhausted hope that maybe healing was possible, even if forgiveness remained distant. He'd gone to his office couch but hadn't slept, mind too active with replaying hours of conversation, analyzing every word and expression for meaning that might indicate progress or regression. The waiting felt different now, less like punishment and more like process that might eventually lead somewhere livable. Days after hospital visit brought subtle continuation of thaw, Addison leaving her door open when she read to boys at bedtime, unspoken invitation that Roman accepted by sitting in hallway just outside the threshold. She never acknowledged his presence, but she read louder, projected her voice so he could hear the stories clearly, and he understood this was compromise. Inclusion without intimacy, connection without commitment. The boys knew he was there and called out goodnights that included him in their evening ritual, expansion of family circle that happened incrementally enough to feel earned rather than given. Cooper's stitches had come out with minimal scarring, thin line on his forehead that would fade with time, physical reminder of the night that had shifted family dynamics. The boy touched the scar frequently, showing it to visitors like badge of honor, telling story of his bravery and his parents working together. Roman noticed Addison didn't correct the narrative even though together was generous interpretation of their current state, allowing her son to hold hope that seemed innocent enough not to crush with reality's complications. Month 4 brought Addison downstairs to main living areas during daytime, no longer confining herself to the East Wing except for sleeping. She'd started using the library, curling up in the window seat with books from the extensive collection, and Roman had learned to share the space without demanding conversation. They'd developed rhythm of coexistence, both reading in companionable silence, broken only by occasional comments about their books, or questions about the boys. The normalcy felt extraordinary after months of careful avoidance, suggestion that maybe they could exist in same space without constant tension. The twins had started asking again about sleeping arrangements, confusion renewed about why family configuration remained fractured. Tommy's parents sleep in same bed, Carter had observed after playdate with school friend. And Sarah's parents do too. Why don't you? The comparison to other families had made both Roman and Addison uncomfortable, neither ready to explain adult complications to 5-year-olds who just wanted conventional family structure. They'd deflected with vague explanations about grown-ups having different arrangements, but the question had lingered between them unspoken in subsequent days. Roman had found Addison crying in his study 3 weeks later, sitting at his desk with photograph in her hands, image of her own mother who'd died when Addison was young. She'd frozen when he'd entered, clearly not expecting anyone, her guard down in private moment of grief. He'd offered to leave, but she'd shaken her head, surprising them both by asking him to stay. "Tell me about your mother," she'd requested, voice raw from crying. "Help me understand how someone could take babies from their mother. Help me make sense of what she did." The conversation that followed had been painful excavation of his childhood, unveiling the cold woman who'd raised him with calculation rather than warmth, creating legacy that valued empire over humanity. The sharing had created unexpected intimacy, vulnerability on both sides that felt different from previous conversations focused on apology and accountability. Roman had confessed that he'd been afraid of becoming like his mother, that his cruelty to Addison had been learned behavior he'd never questioned until consequences became impossible to ignore. Addison had admitted that her own childhood trauma had made her susceptible to relationships with powerful men, seeking protection that always came with cost she couldn't afford to pay. The mutual understanding didn't erase harm, but it added context that made each other's choices marginally more comprehensible if not excusable. Roman had shown Addison the documents he'd found in his mother's safe after her death, evidence of the conspiracy that had stolen the twins and delivered them to him wrapped in lies. The papers included payments to hospital administrator who'd falsified records, instructions for nurse who'd taken the babies from NICU, even draft of the death certificate that had been filed under Addison's name, with cause listed as childbirth complications. His mother's handwriting had covered margins with notes about cleaning up the situation and protecting family reputation, clinical language that made the crime feel like business transaction rather than devastating human theft. Addison had read through everything with shaking hands, her tears staining pages that documented her own erasure, proof that she'd been deliberately removed from her children's lives by someone with resources to make reality conform to her preferences. The revelation had included bank statements showing his mother had continued paying the co-conspirators for years after the initial theft, insurance against anyone coming forward with truth, 5-figure monthly payments to the hospital administrator, the nurse, even the clerk who'd filed the fraudulent death certificate, hush money that demonstrated premeditation and ongoing commitment to maintaining the deception. Roman had traced the payments stopping only months before his mother's own death, final transactions suggesting she'd arranged for silence to continue beyond her life. The calculated nature of the conspiracy was somehow worse than impulsive crime would have been, evidence that his mother had chosen to destroy Addison's life deliberately, and maintained that choice day after day for years. That evening, Addison had joined him for dinner alone. Boys already asleep early after busy day, first meal without their buffer presence. The conversation had been halting at first, both adults hyper-aware of the significance, but it had gradually smoothed into something resembling actual dialogue. They'd discussed books and music, current events and philosophy, discovering shared interests that had been obscured by power dynamics of their previous relationship. Roman had been surprised by her intelligence, chagrined to realize he'd never bothered to know her as person beyond her physical appeal, another failure to add to his growing collection. Thank you all for following this story of second chances and the long road to healing. If you're moved by Roman and Addison's journey, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing you stories about redemption, family, and the courage it takes to rebuild what was broken. Together, we're building a community that believes in the power of transformation.